October 12, 1933, 4:14 p.m., the Upper East Side, Manhattan. The sound wasn't loud, but in the vacuum of a quiet afternoon, it sounded like a gunshot. Crack, a hand meeting a cheek. The girl, barely 18, stumbled back against the brick wall of a high-end confectionery. Her hat tilted, her eyes welled with a mixture of shock and terror. Standing over her was Mickey the Rat Devlin, a small-time enforcer for a rival West Side gang, fueled by cheap gin and a desperate need to feel powerful. He didn't know who she was. To him, she was just a well-dressed girl in the wrong territory, a perfect target for a bit of street-side intimidation. He leaned in, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and rot. "Next time I talk to you, sweetheart, you look me in the eye," he sneered, oblivious to the black Cadillac idling 30 yards down the street. Inside that car, the air turned frigid. 2 men in charcoal suits sat motionless. They didn't reach for their guns, not yet. They reached for a telephone at the next precinct or a runner in the next alley. Because they knew what Mickey didn't. That girl was Anne Schultz. And her father, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, was a man who didn't believe in forgiveness. To understand how a single slap on a Tuesday afternoon turned the Hudson River red, we have to look at the hierarchy of 1930s Manhattan. Manhattan in 1933 was a pressure cooker. Prohibition was gasping its final breaths, and the city's titans were scrambling to consolidate power before the gold rush of illegal alcohol ended. Dutch Schultz was a man built on volatility. He wasn't a man of honor like the Italians. He was a hurricane in a fedora. He ruled his territory through sheer, unadulterated fear. He was a man who once stabbed a rival in the eye with a steak knife at a public dinner just because the man's chewing was too loud. Mickey Devlin walked away from that alley feeling like a king. He didn't notice the silent shadows trailing him. He didn't see the newsboys stopping their shouts as he passed. The word was already out. The city held its breath. The slap had landed. Now the world was waiting for the roar. October 12, 1933. 5:30 p.m. The Hub Social Club, the Bronx. The air inside the Hub was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of polished brass. Dutch Schultz sat behind a mahogany desk that looked like a fortress. He wasn't a large man, but he radiated a density of malice that made the room feel small. When the news reached him, he didn't scream. He didn't flip the table. He simply stopped carving his steak. He looked at his right-hand man, Otto Abadaba Berman, the mathematical genius who fixed the betting slips. "Repeat it," Dutch whispered. The voice was like sandpaper on silk. "Mickey Devlin, West Side." He put hands on her, Arthur, in broad daylight. The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, the elevated train rattled the windows, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heartbeat. Dutch picked up a linen napkin and wiped a stray drop of grease from his lip. In the underworld, reputation is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. If a street punk could touch a Schultz, then the Baron was no longer a baron. He was just a target. 2 years prior, Dutch had survived an assassination attempt by the Cole brothers. He had learned then that mercy is a luxury for the dead. He looked at the clock. It had been 76 minutes since his daughter was touched. "I don't want him dead," Dutch said, his eyes as cold as a November Atlantic. "Not yet. I want him to understand the geometry of his mistake. I want him to see the walls closing in before they hit him." He stood up, smoothing his suit. He decided to visit his daughter. He needed to see the mark on her face. Every shade of purple on her skin would be a year of suffering for the Devlin family. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about the sovereignty of the Schultz empire. Mickey Devlin was currently in a pub on 10th Avenue, bragging to his friends. He had no idea that he had just signed a death warrant written in his own blood. October 12, 1933. 8:12 p.m., Hell's Kitchen. Mickey Devlin was on his 4th whiskey. The lights in the O'Leary's pub were dim, flickering with the instability of New York's aging power grid. He was laughing, reenacting the moment he put that uptown dame in her place. His friends, however, weren't laughing as hard anymore. They had heard the whispers. The grapevine in New York moved faster than a telegram. "Mickey," one of them whispered, glancing at the door. "You sure she was just some nobody?" She was a doll in a fancy coat, that's all, Mickey barked, though a seed of doubt began to itch at the back of his brain. What? You think I'm scared of some rich girl's boyfriend? Suddenly, the front door opened. The cold October wind swept in, swirling dust and discarded betting slips across the sawdust floor. 2 men entered. They weren't wearing the rough wool of the West Side. They were wearing silk-lined overcoats. They didn't order a drink. They walked to the back of the room and sat at a table, their eyes fixed on the back of Mickey's head. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched. This was the Schultz treatment. It wasn't an immediate hit. It was psychological warfare. Dutch wanted his victims to marinate in their own terror. Every time Mickey looked in the mirror behind the bar, he saw those 4 eyes staring back. He tried to finish his drink, but his hand began to shake. The whiskey tasted like copper. He realized then that the pub had gone silent. The bartender was looking down, busily polishing a glass that was already clean. The piano player had stopped mid-measure. Mickey stood up to leave, his bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. But as he reached the door, one of the men spoke. A single sentence that froze the marrow in his bones. The Dutchman wants to know if your hand still hurts. October 13th, 1933. 01:22 a.m., West 44th Street. The rain began to fall, a cold, needle-like drizzle that turned the soot-covered streets into slick ribbons of black. Mickey Devlin was running, not a sprint, but a frantic, stumbling pace through the labyrinth of tenements and warehouses. He had ditched his friends. He had ditched his coat. He was trying to reach the one man he thought could protect him, Bo Weinberg. Weinberg was a powerhouse, a man who navigated the treacherous waters between Schultz and the Italian syndicate. If Mickey could offer something, information, a service, a soul, maybe he could live to see 1934. But Manhattan is an island. And for someone on Dutch Schultz's list, an island is just a cage with water for bars. Every corner Mickey turned, he saw a black car. Every alley he ducked into, he heard the click of heels on pavement. The city itself seemed to be breathing down his neck. He reached a payphone, his fingers fumbling with a nickel. Bo? It's Mickey. I messed up. I messed up real bad. There was a long pause on the other end. The only sound was the crackle of the long-distance line and the heavy rain hitting the phone booth's glass. Mickey, Bo's voice came through, sounding tired. There isn't a hole deep enough in this city. You didn't just hit a girl, you insulted the sun, and now the sun is going down on you. The line went dead. Mickey looked out of the booth. The 2 men from the pub were standing 10 feet away under a street lamp. They weren't holding guns. They were holding a camera. They snapped a photo of his terrified face, a trophy for the boss, before stepping back into the shadows. The game of cat and mouse was over. The cat had seen enough. Now it was time for the harvest. October 13th, 1933. 03:45 a.m. An anonymous garage, Queens. Dutch Schultz didn't sleep much. He found the night more honest than the day. He was standing in a dimly lit garage that smelled of gasoline and old blood. In the center of the room, tied to a heavy wooden chair, was Mickey Devlin. He was no longer the tough guy from 10th Avenue. He was a broken mess of tears and apologies. I didn't know, Mr. Schultz. I swear on my mother's grave I didn't know she was yours. Dutch walked around him slowly. He held a small silver-plated pocket knife. He wasn't looking at Mickey's face. He was looking at Mickey's right hand, the hand that had struck Anne. My mother used to say that a man is only as good as his word, Dutch said softly. But in this city, a man is only as good as what he respects. You didn't respect my blood, which means you don't respect me. And if you don't respect me, you're a glitch in my system. Dutch leaned in close. Do you know what we do with glitches, Mickey? We erase them. He didn't kill him then. Instead, he signaled to a man in the corner, a massive silent figure known as the Beast. The Beast stepped forward with a heavy iron mallet. The hand first, Dutch commanded. Every bone. I want him to feel the weight of that slap for the rest of his very short life. The screams were muffled by the roar of a nearby truck engine being revved by another henchman. It was a calculated industrial violence. No passion, just business. Dutch watched with a detached, almost bored expression. He was thinking about the flowers he would buy his daughter the next morning. But as the first blow landed, a car pulled up outside. A messenger hurried in, looking pale. He whispered into Dutch's ear. The color drained from the mobster's face. October 13th, 1933. 04:10 a.m. The garage. The messenger's news was a lightning bolt. Lucky Luciano wants to see you. Now, he says the Devlin kid is a protected asset of the commission. Dutch felt a surge of white-hot rage. Lucky Luciano, the man who was trying to turn the chaotic underworld into a corporate boardroom. Luciano didn't like messy killings. He didn't like wars over sentimental reasons. To Luciano, Mickey Devlin was a small but necessary link in a West Side distribution chain. Protected, Dutch spat, kicking over a bucket of grease. He touched my daughter. There is no protection for that. Lucky says if you kill him, it's an act of war against the commission, the messenger stammered. Dutch looked at Mickey, who was semi-conscious, his right hand a mangled ruin of flesh and bone. This was the crossroads. If Dutch finished the job, he was inviting a war with the 5 families, a war he might not win. If he let him go, he was a coward in the eyes of his own men. He looked at his men. They were watching him, waiting to see if the beer baron was a lion or a lapdog. The air in the garage was thick with the scent of ozone and tension. Dutch walked over to Mickey and grabbed him by the hair, forcing him to look up. You're a lucky rat, Mickey. The biggest ghosts in New York just offered you a halo. But Dutch Schultz didn't survive the streets by following other people's rules. He had a different plan, one that would satisfy Luciano's protection while ensuring Mickey Devlin never slept soundly again. Throw him in the trunk, Dutch ordered. We're going for a drive. To the docks. October 13th, 1933, 05:30 a.m., Pier 84, Hudson River. The sun was a pale, sickly grey smudge on the horizon. The fog over the Hudson was so thick you could barely see the water. Dutch's convoy pulled up to the edge of the pier. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic slap-slap of the tide against the rotting wood. They dragged Mickey out. He was barely breathing, his face a mask of agony. Dutch stood at the edge of the pier looking out toward the Jersey shore. Luciano said, I can't kill you, Dutch said, lighting a cigarette. The flame flickered in the damp wind. And I'm a man of my word. I won't put a bullet in you. I won't drop you in the drink with concrete shoes. Mickey sobbed, a sound of pure, pathetic relief. But, Dutch continued, his voice dropping to a predatory growl, I never said I'd let you stay in New York, and I never said I'd let you keep your tongue. Before Mickey could scream, the silent henchmen moved with surgical precision. They didn't use a gun. They used a pair of rusted pliers. It was a message to the West Side and to Luciano. You can tell me who to kill, but you can't tell me how to silence a dog. 5 minutes later, a tramp steamer headed for South America slipped into the fog. In its dark, rat-infested hold was a man with no hand and no voice, a nameless ghost discarded by the city that had birthed him. Dutch watched the ship disappear. He felt a sense of grim satisfaction, but he knew this wasn't the end. By defying Luciano's spirit while following the letter of his law, he had just painted a target on his own back. October 14th, 1933. 10 Boons a.m. The Schultz residence. Anne Schultz sat at the breakfast table. The bruise on her cheek had turned a deep, ugly shade of plum. She looked at her father as he entered, his eyes tired, his suit slightly rumpled from the night's work. He placed a box of expensive chocolates on the table. He won't bother you again, sweetheart, Dutch said, his voice uncharacteristically tender. What did you do, Papa? She asked, her voice trembling. I made sure he understood the rules, Dutch replied. But as he looked at his daughter, he realized the cost. The effect of his legend was growing, but so was the resentment. His phone began to ring. It wouldn't stop. It was the Bronx office, the Newark warehouse, the Harlem numbers runners. Everyone was calling because the balance of power had shifted. The Italians were moving on his territory. Because Dutch had spent the night chasing a street punk instead of guarding his borders, a shipment of illegal whiskey had been hijacked in Jersey. 3 of his men were dead. He had protected his family's honor, but he had bled his business dry to do it. In the world of the 1930s Mafia, Emotion was a weakness that the vultures could smell from miles away. "Get the car," Dutch told his driver. "We need to see Luciano. It's time to negotiate." October 14th, 1933, 02:00 p.m., the Waldorf Astoria. The meeting took place in a suite that cost more per night than most New Yorkers made in a year. Lucky Luciano sat by the window, looking like a prince of industry. Beside him was Vito Genovese and Maya Lansky. The room was a fortress of quiet, calculated power. Dutch entered alone. He didn't bring his muscle. He knew that in this room, guns were redundant. "You're getting sloppy, Arthur," Luciano said, not looking up from his paper. "A girl gets slapped and you shut down 3 boroughs to find a nobody. You made us look like emotional children." "He touched my blood, Charlie," Dutch said, his voice tight. "And now your blood is all over the Hudson," Lansky added coldly. "The West Side is in revolt. The cops are sniffing around because of the noise you made in that garage. You're a liability." The realization hit Dutch like a physical blow. The street punk wasn't just a random encounter. Mickey Devlin had been a pawn. Luciano had known Mickey would cause trouble. He had waited for Dutch to overreact, to prove he was too volatile to lead the new syndicate. The slap wasn't an insult. It was a bait. And Dutch, the great beer baron, had swallowed it whole. "What's the price?" Dutch asked, his pride crumbling. "What do you want?" October 15th, 1933. 6:00 p.m., the Palace Chop House, Newark. The city of New York felt different now. To the public, Dutch Schultz was still the terrifying legend, the man who vanished a street punk for a minor insult. But inside the circles of power, he was a marked man. He had traded a large portion of his Harlem interests just to keep his life. He sat in his favorite booth at the Palace Chop House. The lighting was amber. The air smelled of roasted meat and sawdust. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had ordered the destruction of Mickey Devlin. He had won the battle of the alleyway, but he was losing the war of the streets. 2 years later, in this very room, the consequences of his volatility would finally catch up to him in a hail of lead. But for now, he just sat there, a king in a shrinking kingdom. His daughter's bruise would fade. The legend of the street punk's disappearance would be told in bars for decades, but the effect was a double-edged sword. It made people fear him, but it also made them realize he could be manipulated through his heart. In the end, Mickey Devlin was never heard from again. Some say he died in a salt mine in Bolivia. Others say he's a voiceless beggar in Marseille. But in Manhattan, his ghost remained as a warning. In this city, it's not the bullet that kills you, it's the ego. Would you have done the same? If someone touched your family, would you burn your empire down to make them pay? Or would you play the long game? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark history of the American underworld.